The rain was a constant drumming presence in Ketchikan, a grey curtain falling from the sky to meet the churning waters of the inside passage. For Elias Thorne, a man whose life was measured in the bite of a saw and the fall of a tree, the rain was just a fact of life. It slicked the mud on the logging trails, clung to the brim of his hat, and seeped into the very marrow of his bones. He was a man built of muscle and solitude, a veteran of the timber camps, and at 30 years old, he carried the weight of the wilderness on his shoulders. The past few months had been particularly brutal. A series of bad luck, a few close calls with falling timber, and a pervasive sense of loneliness that no amount of whiskey in the saloons could drown. Elias had come to this small frontier town for one reason: to escape. He'd left behind a fractured family and a past he couldn't bear to revisit. The work was hard, honest, and all-consuming. It was the perfect balm for a troubled mind. The logging camp was a world of men, sweat, and the endless roar of the forest, a place where he could lose himself in the physical labor until his thoughts were too exhausted to torment him. One blustery afternoon, the camp boss sent him to town for supplies. The air was thick with the scent of wet spruce and the metallic tang of the sea. As he navigated the muddy boardwalk, a flash of vibrant color caught his eye. It was a woman, standing by the docks, her back to him. Her blanket, woven with intricate geometric patterns of black, red, and turquoise, was a striking contrast to the muted greys and browns of the town. Her long black hair was braided with strips of red cedar, and her face, when she turned, was a study in quiet strength. She had high cheekbones, a straight nose, and eyes that held the deep ancient knowledge of the land itself. She was Haida, a woman of the islands, a stark and beautiful presence in the rough-and-tumble world of Ketchikan. Her name was Liyana. She was here with her elder, an old woman who was bartering smoked fish for flour and sugar. Elias felt a jolt, a physical shock that rattled his stoicism. He'd seen Haida people in town before, but none had ever held his attention like this. There was a pull, an almost magnetic force that he didn't understand, and it scared him. He had built walls around himself, thick and tall, and here was a woman who seemed to see right through them. He finished his errands quickly, trying to ignore the pull, but when he passed the dock again, she was alone, looking out at the water. A cold gust of wind whipped her hair across her face. He hesitated, then against his better judgment, he approached her. "The storm's coming in early," he said, his voice rough from years of yelling over the roar of saws. Liyana turned, her eyes meeting his. They were a deep, dark brown, and they held no fear, only a kind of quiet curiosity. "It always does," she replied, her voice soft but clear, like a song carried on the wind. "The land remembers." There was a moment of silence between them, a space filled with the sound of the wind and the distant cries of gulls. Elias felt a strange, unsettling clarity. He felt like he had to say something, anything, to break this moment before it consumed him. "You should be careful," he said, the words coming out more like a warning than he intended. "The town, it's not always kind to outsiders." Liyana's lips curved into a small, sad smile. "We have survived worse." She gestured to the surrounding forest. "The land is our home. The town is just a place we visit." Elias felt a sudden, powerful urge to know more about her world. The feeling was dangerous, a threat to the carefully constructed isolation he had cultivated. He took a step back, his hands clenching into fists. "Listen," he said, his voice low and intense, a tremor of an emotion he couldn't name running through it. "You should stay away from me. I can't control my mind around you." He didn't wait for her response. He turned and strode away, back up the muddy street, the drumming of the rain a frantic counterpoint to the frantic beat of his own heart. He was a man of the forest, a creature of solitude. He couldn't afford this. He couldn't afford her. Days turned into a week, and Elias tried to bury the memory of the Haida woman beneath the ceaseless demands of his work. He chopped and hauled, his movements sharp and deliberate, as if he could physically cut the thought of her from his mind. But the image of Liyana standing by the water, her eyes full of ancient wisdom, haunted him. He saw her in the patterns of the rain on his window pane, in the dark shadows of the forest, and in the fleeting silence between the echoes of his axe. Meanwhile, a sickness was sweeping through the Haida community. It wasn't the smallpox that had decimated their ancestors, but a new, vicious fever. It was the price of contact with the settlers, the mixing of worlds. Liyana's grandmother, a revered weaver and storyteller, was among the first to fall ill. The fever burned through her, leaving her weak and delirious. The traditional medicines and rituals seemed to have no effect. Liyana knew her grandmother needed more than their knowledge could provide. She needed modern medicine, something the settler's doctor in Ketchikan might have. It was a desperate hope, but it was all she had. With a heavy heart, she wrapped her grandmother in a warm blanket and, with the help of a young cousin, began the difficult journey to town. The rain had turned to a relentless downpour. The trails were slick with mud, and the wind howled through the trees, a cold, mournful sound. Liyana's cousin, a boy of barely 16, was growing weaker, his cough a harsh, rattling sound. The cold was getting to them, and the fever was relentless. They reached the edge of town as the last light of day faded. The doctor's office was closed, a dark, unwelcoming building. The windows were shuttered, and a notice on the door announced that the doctor was out of town tending to a logging accident. A wave of despair washed over Liyana. She looked at her grandmother, her face pale and drawn, her breathing shallow and labored. They had no place to go, no one to turn to. Just as the last of their hope began to wane, Liyana looked up and saw a familiar figure standing under the overhang of a general store, a silhouette against the flickering gas lamp. It was Elias. He was staring out into the rain, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in his hand, a look of deep-seated weariness on his face. Liyana knew she should not approach him. His warning, his strange, intense gaze still lingered in her memory. But desperation overruled caution. He was the only person she knew, the only familiar face in a town of strangers. She walked towards him, her movements slow and deliberate, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm in her chest. "Elias," she said, her voice barely a whisper against the drumming of the rain. He turned, and for a moment his face was a mask of disbelief. He saw her, soaked to the bone, her grandmother's frail form in her arms, and the young boy shivering beside her. The anger and fear he had felt a week ago vanished, replaced by a deep, gut-wrenching pity. He threw the bottle into the street. It shattered, the glass and liquor scattering on the muddy ground, a pathetic end to his attempt to escape. "What happened?" he asked, his voice now gentle, a low rumble of concern. Liyana told him about the fever, about the doctor being gone. She didn't have to say much. The sight of her grandmother was enough. Elias knew the fever she spoke of. He had seen it sweep through other communities, a quiet, deadly enemy. Without a word, he took the old woman's limp form from Liyana's arms. He was surprisingly gentle, his large, calloused hands supporting her with a tenderness that contradicted his rugged appearance. "My cabin," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "It's small, but it's warm." He didn't wait for her to agree. He simply began to walk, carrying the elder with an ease that spoke of immense strength. As they walked, Liyana felt a small spark of hope flicker within her. This man, who had warned her away, was now their only lifeline. The rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean. But something else was beginning to stir, something new, a fragile connection forged in the heart of the Alaskan wilderness. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to not miss the continuation of this incredible story. Elias's cabin was a simple affair, a single room of rough-hewn logs, a wood stove in the center, and a narrow cot pushed against one wall. The air was thick with the scent of pine and wood smoke, a comforting, earthy smell. He laid Liyana's grandmother on the cot, covering her with a thick wool blanket. The hours that followed were a blur of activity. Elias fetched fresh water from the creek, and Liyana boiled it over the stove. He went out into the storm to chop more firewood, his axe ringing out in the cold night. Liyana and her cousin, a boy named Kona, huddled close to the stove, trying to ward off the chill. Elias watched Liyana. She moved with a quiet grace, her hands gentle as she wiped her grandmother's feverish brow. He saw the worry etched on her face, but also a deep, unshakable resolve. She was a woman of the land, of the sea, and of a strength he hadn't encountered before. He had warned her away, but she had come back, a beacon of light in the darkness he had so carefully cultivated. As the night wore on, Liyana's grandmother's fever spiked. She tossed and turned, murmuring in her native language. Liyana held her hand, whispering to her stories of their people, of the longhouses and the totems, of the salmon and the eagles. It was a lifeline of words, a way to anchor her grandmother to the world. Elias, sitting in a corner, listened. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the emotion. He felt the weight of their culture, their history, their resilience. He also felt the weight of his own past, of the things he had run from, of the mistakes that had led him to this isolated existence. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. He was a part of this small circle of hope and fear. The next morning, the fever broke. The old woman's breathing became more regular, and she finally slipped into a deep, peaceful sleep. A collective sigh of relief filled the small cabin. Kona, who had also been touched by the fever, was finally resting, his cheeks regaining a bit of color. Liyana looked at Elias, her eyes brimming with a gratitude so profound it needed no words. He simply nodded, his gaze steady. The barrier he had tried to build between them was gone. It had crumbled in the face of shared struggle, of human connection. A few days later, Liyana's grandmother was strong enough to make the journey back. Kona had recovered completely. As they prepared to leave, the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a golden light on the muddy streets of Ketchikan. The world seemed reborn, fresh and clean after the storm. "Thank you, Elias," Liyana said, her voice filled with emotion. "You saved us." Elias, for his part, felt a lump in his throat. He had done nothing but what any man would have done. But being thanked, being seen, felt like a foreign concept. "It was nothing," he mumbled. "It was everything," she corrected, her hand reaching out to touch his, her fingers warm and soft against his rough, calloused palm. "You are a good man, Elias Thorne." He looked into her eyes, and the world seemed to stop. The roar of the forest, the cries of the gulls, the distant sounds of the town all faded away. There was only her, and the undeniable truth in her gaze. He had found a reason to stay, not just in the physical sense, but in his heart. He took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it gently. "Come back to me," he said, his voice raw with a newfound vulnerability. "Stay. Don't go." Liyana's lips curved into a sad but knowing smile. "I must go. The land is my home. My people need me." She squeezed his hand, a promise in the gesture. "But I will return. The world is small, Elias. We will meet again." With that, she turned and walked away, her small figure and the two Haida elders disappearing into the new sunlit day. Elias stood there for a long time, his hand still tingling from her touch. The loneliness he had felt for so long had not vanished, but it was no longer a heavy, oppressive weight. It was now a hollow, a space waiting to be filled. He knew now what he was fighting for. He knew now what he wanted to come back to. And for the first time in a very long time, Elias Thorne, the lonely lumberjack, felt a sense of hope. His mind, once a fortress of solitude, was now open, and he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he was ready for whatever the future and Liyana would bring. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to not miss the final chapter of this incredible story.